One summer afternoon, alongside a rushing river, a group of villagers gathered for a picnic. As they shared food and enjoyed conversation, someone spotted a baby in the river, flailing helplessly against the swift current. Heedless of risk, one brave soul dove into the rapids and pulled the baby to safety. A few minutes later, the villagers noticed a second screaming baby in the river, and another courageous soul threw caution to the wind and pulled that baby to safety as well. Inexplicably, the imperiled babies continued to come, and the villagers began to organize their heroic efforts to save as many babies as possible. As the rescue continued, two of the villagers pulled away and started to run along the shore of the river. "Where are you going?" cried a villager from the shore of the river. "We need you here to help save these babies." One turned and replied, "We're going upstream to stop whoever is throwing them in." I thought of this familiar parable on Thursday evening as I watched the metal capsule dubbed Phoenix carry one Chilean miner after another from a deep prison of ancient rock to the freedom of sunlight and safety. The 2-month mission to rescue the 33 miners turned out to be a complete triumph, as the miners' unprecedented endurance matched their rescuers' unparalleled ingenuity. It would be possible, of course, to design mines so that heroism of this magnitude wouldn't be needed. But safety, pre-board escape routes, ample stashes of food and water, reinforced tunnels, multiple air shafts, costs money. In other words, we already know who is throwing the miners under the rubble. 29 miners died in West Virginia last April. At least 20 miners died yesterday in a coal mine in China, the inferno of the mining underworld. More than 2,600 miners died in China just last year. Miners shouldn't need to rely on butterflies to save them. As you've doubtless heard, 2 of the Chilean miners were driving their truck in the mine before the collapse. They saw a white butterfly, a rarity at those depths, and slowed down to watch it. Moments later, the tunnel in front of them collapsed. They were saved by a white butterfly. In my sermon 2 weeks ago, I spoke about the legendary musician and producer Brian Eno, who has produced 7 albums for U2 and the 2 most recent albums for Coldplay. When Eno moved from his native England to New York City in the late 1970s, he visited the home of a wealthy friend who lived in a lavish apartment located in a decrepit building in a rundown neighborhood. He was stunned by her lack of concern for what lay beyond the walls of her home. Eno described her as living in the small here. He later coined the term the big here as a way of describing an expansive sense of where you are. In his essay titled The Big Here and the Long Now, Eno writes, "I noticed that this very local attitude toward space in New York paralleled an equally limited attitude toward time. Everything was exciting, fast, current, and temporary. Enormous buildings came and went. Careers rose and crashed in weeks. You rarely got the feeling that anyone had the time to think 2 years ahead, let alone 10 or 100. Everyone seemed to be passing through. It was undeniably lively, but the downside was that it seemed selfish, irresponsible, and randomly dangerous. Eno came to think of this view of time as the short now, which suggested the possibility of its opposite, the long now. In a new poem titled Pioneers, the Pulitzer Prize-winning American poet Carl Dennis writes, "If time were in fact like money, we could bank a day like this one that as yet we have no plans for, and spend it later when we are ready, along with any interest that's piled up. Instead, we're obliged to live it now." We're obliged to live time now. Save the baby, admire the butterfly, drill the escape shaft, lower the phoenix. We're obliged to live now, not when we're ready, but now. But what it means to live now depends on what we mean by now. The long now, Eno says, is the recognition that the precise moment you're in grows out of the past and plants a seed for the future. The longer our sense of now, the more of the past and future it includes. Eno notes the irony that at a time when humanity has the technological power to create vast global changes that will echo down through the centuries, most of our systems are geared to increasingly short nows. Companies plan for the next shareholders' meeting. Politicians perform for the next election or the next opinion poll. The media programs for overnight ratings. As more and more of our lives gets rewritten for short attention span theater, it's enough to make us wistful for those mythic good old days when life was simple, time moved slowly, and progress was easy to mark. As Carl Dennis says in his poem, "Why can't this day be like the one our predecessors devoted to outfitting a wagon train and heading off toward the lush land of the middle border? How easy, then, to prove we're making progress when another evening means another inch marked on the map from here to there. No need to rush, so long as our pace is steady." The question for us is how to live the long now. Should we save the baby or capture the baby thrower? Admire the butterfly or shore up the tunnel? Pull up the phoenix or pillory those who make phoenix necessary? Carl Dennis puts the quandary this way: should we break down today, as we've done with other days, into desk work and yard work, supper and post-supper pastimes, or devote it all to making a plan for one bold enterprise that begins tomorrow? What would that be exactly? Something more, it would seem, than merely doing the old work with a better attitude. To live in the long now is not merely doing old work with a better attitude. Rather, the long now is a different enterprise. It begins with imagination. In Brian Eno's terms, we create realities by first imagining them, experiencing them in our minds. When Martin Luther King proclaimed, "I have a dream," he was inviting others to dream with him. Once a dream, the long now, becomes shared, the current moment, the short now, gets measured against it and then modified toward it. Eno says, as soon as we sense the possibility of a more desirable world, we begin behaving differently, as though that world is starting to come into existence, as though, in our minds at least, we're already there. The dream becomes an invisible force that pulls us forward. By this process, it starts to become true. The act of imagining something makes it real.